I am I will be making videos like this for class materials and technical demos. We will still be having Zoom meetings to kind of go over questions that you may have or check in with each other or just troubleshoot issues. But I figured for actual class materials, this would be a better way to deliver them. That's more accessible to everyone, even if you can't make the Zoom meeting. Yeah, and also just like connectivity issues. I figured this is probably the safest bet. So, um, yeah, it's been a crazy few weeks. I figure we could all use some review. And so I would like to go over JavaScript setup. Right. So, what is JavaScript? What are libraries? These kinds of things. So, yeah, review. JavaScript is the third piece of the puzzle in terms of what a website is made out of. We've talked about HTML, which is the skeleton or the structure or layout of a site, of a web page, and CSS is the look and feel, like colors, font style, that kind of thing. I like to think of JavaScript as anything to do with behavior or interactivity. So this is really where you can start to implement logic into your web page and complex animations like mouse interaction, that kind of stuff. And there's a little bit of crossover, like we talked about like being able to do hover effects in CSS. But JavaScript really like gives you a lot of functionality in that respect. Cool. So let me start setting up a project so we can go over how to do that from the start. So I will, and this is all review, so feel free to fast forward anything that you feel comfortable with already. But yeah, so I'm going to make a new folder. I always make a new folder for every project, keep things organized. I will call this P5 demo. And then once I make that folder, I will drag it into Sublime. I'm going to hit cancel. Cool. So I'm going to create my 3 files. I'll start with the index.html. So I right click on a Mac, that's control click on the folder. New file. And I like to type the name of the file at the top of the page and then hit Command S for save or file save, whatever you're more comfortable with. That way the name is already populated here. I'll make sure that it's in the right folder. This is important. And it is, so I'll hit save. And now you should see everything's in the right place. I can get rid of this index.html. Another shortcut, it might be slightly different on your machine. Like you may, well, for me, if I type exclamation point, and this only works after I've saved the file because then it knows it's an HTML file. If I do it before, it won't work. But if I do exclamation point and then hit tab, it kind of pre-populates an HTML structure, which is super helpful in terms of, time. For you, it might be, sometimes I know it's like you type out the word HTML and then hit tab. And if neither of those work, it's good practice to type all of this stuff out anyway. But yeah, so I'll hit save and then let me make my other 2 files. So I'll right click again, do styles.css. Cool, it's there. And then I'll delete this. Hit save again. And I will create a new file for my JavaScript file. I like to call my JavaScript files main.js. And by the way, like this name is not, like you can call these files whatever you want. They just have to be consistent wherever you link to them. So in your styles.css can be like whatever.css, but it has to be the same name in your index.html file in order for everything to be linked together. But yeah, just out of habit, I always do styles.css and main.js. So I'll save it, and then I don't need this anymore. and save it. Cool. So I have all these 3 files, but we're not done yet. We have a few more steps. So as you may recall, to link our CSS file, we need to add a link tag. So I'll type link and hit tab. For you may have, sometimes when you do that, it has this extra property that's like type, I forget, it's like type style sheet or something. You want to make sure that that's not there. You only want this rel property and then href. And when I say property, I'm referring to like these little pieces of code in our tags that are green. But yeah, so you just want rel and href. And within href, you want to actually type the file name. So in our case, it's styles.css. And something else to note is that the link tag is singular. Like with a lot of tags, like title, for example, there's an opening and a closing one. Head dead. I don't know when I did that. But even our head and our body tag, they all open and close, right? So there's only like a few tags that don't do that. Link tag is one of them. Also, you may get this message, just hit cancel. Cool. So we've linked our style sheet. Now, how do we link a JavaScript file? So instead of using, so with CSS, you use a link tag. But with JavaScript, you use a script tag. And I like to, you can put a script tag in the head, but HTML kind of goes from top to bottom. And sometimes your JavaScript is kind of dependent on your HTML. Like, for example, hypothetically, let's say in our job, we're not going to do this, but hypothetically, in our JavaScript, if we were, I don't know, if there was a p tag in here and we wanted to change the color of the p tag when we clicked on it, if we put our script tag up here, it would load before the p tag down here. And so that would be a problem because your JavaScript code would run before the p tag was loaded, and so there would be an error. So just kind of in like order of operations, just to be on the safe side, I always put my script tag at the bottom of my body tag. And again, I typed out script and hit tab. You can do that for most tags in HTML, and that will auto-populate. Yeah, so I would like, if I was writing HTML, I would write it here, above my script tag. Make sure my script tag is the last thing before this closing body tag. But yeah, this is not, the script tag needs a source still. So with the link tag up here, we do href to link to the actual file name. But with a script tag, we do src, which stands for source. So src main.js. And now everything is linked together. But there's one more step. Right, so, all right, so where does P5 come into all of this? HTML is a language, CSS is a language, JavaScript is a language. P5.js is not a coding language. It is a coding library. In coding, a library is just a large snippet of code that someone else has written that you include in your project in order to have more functionality. So, literally P5.js is like a long file of just JavaScript code that someone else has written, specifically an artist called Lauren McCarthy, has written to give JavaScript extra functionality, specifically around like drawing and animation. So what we are doing when I say we need to include this library, include the P5.js library, I'm essentially saying we need to link to it so that we have access. So this file is loaded in our project before we start typing JavaScript code. So there's a few ways you can do that. You can download the P5.js file and include it in your project folder, kind of like we would normally with main.js. But you can also link to it on the internet. because P5JS is also hosted online. Let's see if I have it anywhere. All right, so yeah. Oh, sorry. Okay, so let me type the code first, and then I'll kind of talk about what it actually is doing. So, oops, double project. All right, so I have my script tag that is linking to my JavaScript file. And because in our JavaScript we are using P5, P5 needs to be loaded before our JavaScript file is loaded. So above the script tag I've already written. That's really important. If I put it afterwards, it won't work. So it has to be above. So you do your P5 first, then JavaScript file. All right, so I'll do another script tag. But this time the source will be this link down here that I have in the slideshow. https cdn.js deliver.net/ and you guys can obviously copy paste this, but for the sake of the video, I'll just type it out. Cool. So this is literally telling our project to go on the internet, find this file, and link it in our project. And just to show you like what I mean by when I say libraries are just long pieces of code that someone else has written, you don't need to follow along in this step, but just to show you, for example, I will copy and paste this link right here into the browser. So this is the P5JS library. This is what we're including in our project when we do that. And it's literally, I mean, it's not even loading properly, but it's literally just a lot of JavaScript code that someone else has written. So yeah, but that's like without this, you won't have that. You'll still be able to write JavaScript, but you won't have kind of the extra functionality that P5JS allows us. And P5JS was written, or processing in general was written for artists. So it's made with the idea that we want to start making like creative visuals with JavaScript. How do we do that? And I'm not going to go into like processing versus P5 because we talked about it already, but this is like a really good video. I know I told you guys to watch this before, but I feel like this video really goes into like what is processing versus P5 versus JavaScript. But yeah, cool. So hopefully that makes sense. For the rest of this demo, so that's how you set up your files, right? That's fine. That's like basically it. And then you would code everything in here under main.js. But for the purposes of this video, because it's a little bit easier for me to, it's a little bit difficult for me to switch back and forth between the browser and Sublime for recording, I'm going to actually use the P5 editor. And some of you may have played around with this already, but some of you may not have. And I also feel like there's maybe some confusion around P5 versus the P5 editor. I feel like some people are using those synonymously. But P5 is the library. And so P5, the editor is, let's see, I don't remember the URL off the top of my head. P5 web editor. All right, so the P5 web editor is what is called a sandbox. There are websites, not just editor.p5js.org, but other websites that allow you to like code within the browser just to kind of like test and preview things really easily. That's all this P5 editor is. It's just like a way for you to start writing JavaScript without having to do this whole setup. Not a way for you to start writing JavaScript with the P5 library. It's really like a learning tool. Like if you wrote a bunch of code here, it would stay here, right? Like you can't actually push it to like CyberDuck or anything. So in order to do that, you have to do it kind of this way, like we've been doing. But I don't know. For some people, it seems like it's easier to work in here while you're trying to code the JavaScript and then transfer it to here. That's fine too. Maybe I'll do that just to show you how to do it. But yeah, hopefully that's clear, the difference between the editor and P5. The editor is, when I say the editor, it's literally this website, editor.p5js.org, that I'm talking about, which is like an add-on. This is like a website for sandbox coding. And just to maybe flesh out more what I mean by sandbox coding, there are other websites like codepen.io that allow you to just like code something and see your code and the result at the same time. So like you can't really like this is stuck within the website. To put this on like, I don't know, like someone else's portfolio site, this burger, you'd have to copy and paste it into like the actual site structure. But this is just a way for people to like easily share code and test code right here in the browser without having to like use Sublime and refresh the browser or that kind of thing. There's also another one called Glitch. I think it's glitch.com. Yeah. Oops. Yeah, so you're welcome to check these out, but just know that you will eventually have to, like, if you to upload to CyberDuck, you'll eventually have to like bring it back to this workflow of using the folder in Sublime. But yeah, I'll use the editor for now just because it's like easy for video recording purposes, to show you the result really quickly. Cool. Where are we at? Right. So every P5JS sketch starts with two important parts. And I refer to, like, when I say sketch, I just mean like your code. You'll notice that on the website and also like in those tutorial videos that I sent, the word sketch comes up often. I think that's just because like we think of P5JS as a JavaScript library for drawing, so we think of like our code is sketching almost like you're drawing a picture. But yeah, every sketch starts with, it has two components, setup and draw, which if you're using the editor, they already have that for you, like when you start a new sketch. But if you're starting from scratch in main.js, you'll have to type that out yourself. Yeah, so let's see. Right, so setup runs once. I'll kind of zoom through this because we already talked about this last class, but setup runs once. That's kind of where you set up things like your background, anything that happens only once. Draw runs continuously. It's kind of like each frame of your animation. This is like where you actually have movement happening. Yeah, if you're working in, we'll talk about this at the end of the video when I transfer what I've written in here to Sublime. But yeah, this is just like an extra step that you need to do in your HTML. Cool. All right, so now I want to talk about some key concepts in P5 and JavaScript that we touched upon last week, but I really want to flesh them out this week because they're important. One is that order matters in P5, which you probably have already noticed by doing the homework. The order in which you type things matters. So just to show you, let's say, all right, here's my sketch. So let's say I want to draw a blue ellipse. I will first set my fill color. RGB, right? So 0, 0, 255. Ellipse, let's put it at 10, 10, 20, 20. Right, so I have a blue ellipse now. If I were to move this, let's see. If I were to create another ellipse, and let's move it just so we can see that it's different. I'll move it to 50 instead of 10. Cool. So now I have 2 blue ellipses. So order matters. I set the fill on line 7. So anything that comes after line 7 will have the blue fill color. However, if I go in here and I type, let's say I want the second ellipse to be green. If I type the fill down here, that would not work because you set the color and then you draw the thing. So right now this fill is not being applied to anything because there's nothing after it. So if I want my second ellipse to be green, I would have to do it in this order. Fill, ellipse, fill, ellipse. And this order thing will come up again as I introduce some new topics today as well. But yeah, just know that, like, think about as you're planning out your drawings, like how you might have to order things in order to get the results that you want. I also want to talk about some key JavaScript concepts because last week, or not last week, however many weeks ago we last met, we kind of dove into P5.js and started playing around. But I kind of want to walk back and talk about JavaScript in general and like some coding concepts. So one thing I kind of zoomed by was variables. Variables are kind of like containers in JavaScript. They just allow you to store values. And so why might you want to do that? Let's say I want to move my ellipse over by 1 pixel every frame. So, right, we know that draw is running over and over again. One way we can do that is with variables. So generally you set your variables at the top of your file, like outside of setup and draw. And variables are set with this keyword var, V-A-R, and then a name. So like you name your container, so name your variable. So I'll say var, and this name can be whatever you want. It can be an X, it can be the word move. I'll call it amount, and I'll set it to 0. So now I can do stuff like, so why might I want to use variables? Now that I have this variable called amount, I can do stuff like, instead of here where I have my ellipse positioned at 10 pixels by 10 pixels, instead of using the number 10, I can now use my variable name amount. And so now it's a 0, 10. Great. All right. So still not that great. What are we trying to do here? We're trying to move it by 1 every time. But because this variable is a stored value, we can change it. And this is really where it becomes dynamic. So if we think about it logically, if I want my circle to move across the screen by 1 each frame, for each loop, I need to set amount equal to itself plus 1, right? So the first time it's 0, the second time I want it to be 1, the second time I want it to be 2, and so on and so forth. So what I can do is inside of my draw function, I can do this. I can do amount is equal to amount plus 1. And then you will now see my ellipse moves. So yeah, if I had just used a number here, there would be no way for me to change it dynamically in this way. So variables are going to come up a lot. And it's a little tricky to figure out like when you need a variable and when you don't. It just takes practice and thinking about things logically, like, right, I need to store a value because I'm changing it every loop. Usually if you have to change something in a loop mathematically like this, you need a variable. And just to introduce like another concept that I didn't actually put in the slides, but the reason why I have to define my variable up here is because if I had done something like this, it's not going to work because draw runs every frame, right? So it's like every loop I'm coming back and resetting amount to 0. So every time it gets to this line, it's always 0 still, because I'm running draw once, it's 0, 0, then it becomes 1 down here, but then it goes back to the beginning, becomes 0 again, 0, 1 over here. So it never actually changes. But if I store this variable outside of my functions, then amount is defined as 0 only once. So that way, we're not accidentally resetting it here. And that's why it works. And you might be asking, why can't I do something like this, where I put, because setup only runs once, right? Var amount equals 0. That has to do with, how do I explain? So things that are defined inside of functions are only accessible within that function. So amount here, this line 14 doesn't have access to line 5 because line 5 is inside our setup function. So whatever's inside of draw doesn't have access to whatever's inside of setup. However, anything outside of, because if we put it outside of setup and draw, it's outside of both of them, then they both have, like, inside of setup and inside of draw, you both have access to amount. Yeah, that part is a little confusing, but just know that, know that usually when you're defining variables, you want to have it outside of these functions. Cool. All right, so on that note, we should probably also talk about this concept of data types. So in JavaScript, there are many different things called data types. So variables. So right now we're playing with numbers, right? We have var amount equals 0. In JavaScript, things can be numbers. Numbers, they can be integers or floats. So those are two different data types that we have in JavaScript. However, we also have things like text. Like, what if we wanted, how do I show this? So what if we wanted to store the word hello for some reason? We're not really going to use it, but just for example's sake, let's say I wanted to store the word hello in this variable called message. This won't work because the data type of text is called a string in JavaScript, and to write text in JavaScript, you need these quotes around it. Yeah, so numbers and stuff, they don't need quotes around them, but text does generally. And the reason why these don't have quotes around them is because they are not text. Like, yes, they are words, but they are names that we're giving variables. So because they are names that we are defining as a variable name, they don't need the quotes. It's only like because we're setting this variable equal to hello, hello needs quotes. So that's a little confusing too, but just generally, like, when you're using text, usually it's in string. I mean in quotations, my bad. Cool. There are other data types as well. And this stuff will kind of, like, if you're not getting this right now, like, what is a data type, don't worry too much about it, because it'll kind of make itself clear as we go through examples that actually use text or strings. And the same kind of goes for this as well. So there's another data type called Booleans, which is essentially just true or false. Like, things can be equal to true or equal to false in JavaScript. So message could be equal to true or false. In terms of why you would want to do this, we'll get to that later, but just know that the word true and the word false are keywords in JavaScript that mean something. They mean negative or positive. And that can be used logically later on. But yeah, so that also comes up because you don't want to name anything true, because that's going to cause errors. There's certain words that are reserved for doing stuff in JavaScript. True and false being that, because they're reserved as Booleans. But yeah, all right. So what else? Arrays are another data type. They are essentially just groups of things. You can mix data types within those groups. So, like, let's say we want message to be equal to a series of numbers. To denote an array, you have these square brackets, and then you put whatever you want inside of it, separated by commas. So now message is equal to a group of numbers, 1, 2, 3, 4 numbers to be exact. And something to note is with arrays, you can mix data types. Like, they don't all have to be numbers or all have to be strings or all have to be Booleans. You can kind of do stuff like have things combined here. That's fine. When you're working in the editor, you can use this area down here to troubleshoot things. It's called a console. And to access it within the browser, like if you're working with Sublime, it's kind of the same way I'll just do it on this Google page just to show. It's kind of the same way we would do with this Chrome inspector. Like usually you're here, right? When you're inspecting stuff for CSS and JavaScript. If you go up to console here, this is where you can start to troubleshoot stuff in JavaScript. But yeah, so this is the equivalent of that area in the P5 online editor. But okay, why would you want that? Well, first of all, if you have a mistake, like just to show you, let me just do something like that. Usually if there's a mistake in your code, it will spit out the problem down here in your console. And usually this stuff doesn't really make sense. Like, what does uncaught syntax error mean? Or unexpected token. But the reason why this can be very useful is that usually it tells you exactly what line the problem is on. So it's saying, okay, there's a problem on line 12. So I can go to line 12 and find the problem. So yeah, that's a tip. And then also the other area where that's useful is that there is a way to what's called console logging, but basically just spit out values that you're trying to check on down here. So let's say I want to check that message is in fact equal to this stuff. I could do something like console.log message. So if everything worked correctly, it should just spit out this stuff down here. And it does. We've got the right thing. 0, hello, true, 9. Let's try console logging. Let's try console logging the value of amount as it increases. So if I go down here and I do console.log amount, theoretically, it should, for every frame, it should start with 0, go to 1, 2, 3, 4, right? And actually it'll start with 1 because it's console logging after we increase it. Yeah, so see down here, the numbers are increasing by 1. So yeah, console logging is useful just for like checking values if you're struggling. You probably won't use it so much at this point, but just bring that up. Cool. All right. So next thing, if-else statements. If-else statements are very useful. I think you'll probably be using that the most at this point. Out of these other things that I've just shown. If-else statements are just ways for you to introduce logic. Like, essentially they do things like this. Like, if some condition is true, if someone is clicking, if someone is not clicking, if amount is greater than 100. If some condition is true, you can execute code. Otherwise, execute some other code. So it's a way for you to run code conditionally. Like, only if something is true, or if something is not true, do something. And this kind of logic can be stacked. It doesn't have to just be like if something is true or if it's not true. It can be if some condition is true, otherwise if another condition is true, otherwise if another condition is true. So you can start to build logic out that way. Let's see. What's an easy way to do this? All right, so we know amount is increasing by 1 every time. Let's say we want, let's say I want the background to be a different color depending on how far the ellipse has moved across the screen. So I can do something like if amount, let's say if amount is greater than 100, I want, and if you can refer to the slides for the syntax, but you use these curly brackets here. So if the amount is greater than 100, I want the background to be black. Else, I want the background to be gray. See, it changed as soon as it got to 100. Let's say I want a third value in there. Like, else if sorry, let me just clean this up a bit. All right, else if amount is, all right, so if it's not greater than 100, let's say if it's greater than 50, I want the background to be red. Ta-da. So yeah, these are just if else is a really good way to introduce logic into your sketches. Cool. And on that note, let's talk about mouse interaction. So let's say I want to do something like if the mouse is pressed, do something. Otherwise, if the mouse isn't pressed, do something else. P5 comes with built-in variables. So we know what variables are, right? When I was showing variables, we were defining variables like amount and message. But in this case, I am saying that P5, the library, comes with variables that are already defined for us around mouse interaction. So for example, we've got mouse X. I don't know why this color coding is off, but mouse X is a variable that is automatically equal to the current position of the mouse on the X-axis. So really good for keeping track of where on your sketch the mouse is. And likewise, mouse Y is the same thing, but for the Y-axis. And mouse is pressed is a variable that is equal to true if the mouse is being pressed. So again, here's a Boolean example. It's equal to the Boolean true if the mouse is being pressed, otherwise it's equal to false. So yeah, how might we use this? So here we can use our if else statement. So yeah, let's do it. So let's do something like underneath here. Let's do if mouse is pressed. Oops. And I should say that in JavaScript, and I'm sure you've already noticed this just from doing homework and troubleshooting things, but capitals matter. So if I did something like, let's see. Yes, so mouse is pressed. Note that mouse is lowercase. Usually that's the case with JavaScript variables, like the first word, so to speak, in the name is lowercase and everything after it is capitalized. But yeah, so this is mouse is pressed. If I were to do something like change this to lowercase, it wouldn't work. So you have to be very careful about copying the exact capitalization. All right, so if mouse is pressed equals true. And so this right here is not a mistake. In JavaScript, when you use equal signs in different ways, right? Like over here, for example, on line 21, we are setting the variable amount equal to amount plus 1. So this is called like declaring. We are declaring that amount is now equal to amount plus 1. Whereas here, we're trying to check if a statement is true, right? We're checking. We're not declaring. We're not setting mouse is pressed equal to true. We are checking if it's true. And so that is why I use 2 equal signs instead of 1. If I used 1, it would be me saying mouse is pressed. I'm setting it equal to true. But no, I'm trying to check if it is equal to true. So I do mouse is pressed equals true. So let's see. What do I have in the example here? All right, so if it's true, we want to draw an ellipse, and otherwise we'll draw a rectangle. Easy enough. So if it's true, let's say I want to draw an ellipse at 50-50, and I'll make it, just to make our lives easier, I'll make it also 50 by 50 in terms of radius. And then otherwise, so if it's not true, and you also want to be careful about your brackets. Like, it would be very easy for me to forget to put my closing bracket, and that can cause errors too. But just know, just keep track of like where your brackets open and close. That'll help you avoid errors. Right, so otherwise, if it's not true, I'll draw a rectangle in that same spot. So, and I know you guys can't see me clicking, but just know that I'm clicking, and it's changing to a circle. Oh, and by the way, we talked about this last class a little bit, but different types of shapes are positioned differently. Like, you'll notice, you would think that they would be centered, right? The circle and the rectangle would be centered. But the reason that's not the case is because ellipses are positioned by their center, whereas rectangles, by default at least, are positioned by the top left corner. So as opposed to like the center of each shape being aligned, it's actually like the corner of the rectangle being aligned with the center of the circle. So that's just something to note. But yeah, it's working, right? So that's something. All right, what if I wanted this shape to always be where my mouse is? I could very simply just use my mouse X and mouse Y variables. I can do something like, instead of placing it at 50X and 50Y, I can do mouse X and mouse Y. And same for my rectangle. Mouse Y, not mouse T. Right, so now it's always following my mouse, which is kind of cool. One way I could fix this like rectangle corner thing is by thinking about it logically. Like, we know that the corner is being placed where the mouse is, right? So if we think about it, we're like trying to move the rectangle. You guys can't see my fingers, but I'm trying to move the rectangle like up and over, like up by half its own height and over to the left by half its own width. And we know, because we're setting it to 50 by 50, we know how wide and how tall it is. So we could do something like, let's see if this works. Right? Like, we can simply just say, like, place it wherever mouse X is minus half its own width. Right, see? And now it's centered. So yeah, as you're working on sketches, think about ways in which you can introduce logic, because that's really what this is all about. Like, that is the main cool thing about JavaScript, is that you can start to like be creative with logic. That's something that you cannot really do with just HTML and CSS. Cool. So let's see what else I have. Transformation. So at this point, you probably, I would say, take a break and play around with what we just did. Take note if you're unclear on anything. I think it's good to come to our Zoom session with questions in mind that you want to ask. And then when you come back from your break, we will talk about transformations in P5.js. And by transformations, I mean like rotating, flipping things, because it's a little bit confusing. So yeah. All right. I will see you in a bit. Transformations in P5.js. All right. So brace yourselves. I'm actually going to, for this demo, I will start a new sketch. So actually, this is probably a good time to show you a little bit more of the editor's capabilities. So first of all, I happen to be already logged in here, but let me just see how this looks like if you're not logged in. Right. So if you're using the editor, something to take note of is that you can save sketches if you log in. So you can just simply go to login and log in with your email. And once you are logged in, the cool thing is you can do stuff like file, save. All right. And then now you have the ability to come back to your sketch, edit it, whatever. And you can also share the link, which is kind of helpful. So yeah, I can like take this link. Actually, I will do this. I will take this link and put it in the slideshow here. Right. And so yeah, if you click on that link, you will see everything I've done thus far. So that's a feature to take note of. Cool. And then before we get to transformations, one other thing I want to show is like how you might translate this sketch back to Sublime. Like if you wanted to upload it to CyberDuck or on your own website. To do that, we would let's see. Let me just backtrack a little bit here. All right, so first thing is, let me open up my HTML again. All right, so back to Sublime. We are back with this index main.js, styles.css. One extra step that I have to do is create a place for my P5 sketch to go. When you're in the editor, it just automatically shows up, but for this, you need to add like some div or something where your sketch can go into. So I will do a div with the ID, and you need to give it a name, like a unique name that you can, or unique ID rather, that you can refer to in your JavaScript. So I will call it ID my canvas and close it. So that's div ID my canvas. And let me make this a little bigger. All of this is in the slides as well. Just realized that this might be a little bit small to read. Cool. So now that I have that, I can move over to my JavaScript. I am going to copy everything I have over from the editor and paste it into my JavaScript file. And then I need to do one more thing. I need to edit my setup function a little bit to use this div. So to do that, I will set my canvas here equal to a variable, var c equals create canvas. And then I will do c.parent. So I'm parenting, I know this probably doesn't really make much sense to you guys, but parenting the canvas to this div. I'm kind of like putting the canvas inside of this div. So I need to do C being the canvas itself, the area that I'm drawing on, c.parent, and then the ID of the div. So I called it my canvas, right? Cool, and that should theoretically be it. Let's just see if I made any mistakes. Yeah, and just like you normally would, you drag your index.html file into the browser. Cool. It seemed to work. Great. One other thing I want to show you is by default, when you use the editor online, so see how it says create canvas 400, 400. That's saying that the canvas size is 400 pixels by 400. Let's say I would want the canvas size to just be the width of the browser and the height of the browser. Instead of setting it to 400 by 400, I think I can just do width and height. It might be canvas width and canvas height, but let's just double check. I think I can just do width and height and it will... Nope. All right. My bad. No, it's not canvas width. It's window width. My bad. And window height. And height has to be capitalized and width has to be capitalized. All right, window width and window height. That should change it. There we go. So now it's taking up this whole... and I can see there's a little bit of white space here. I believe that is because there is a margin on my body. So I'm going to go over to styles.css. Body margin 0. Let's see if that fixes it. Yes. All right. So that was it. Cool. So that's just how you would transfer, like, if you were working on the online editor over to your Sublime. And if I were to upload this to CyberDuck, I would just do it like you normally would. Upload your folder. Cool. All right. So back to transformations. Let me start a new sketch. And I will get to here. All right. So what do I mean when I say transformations? Things like translate, rotate, scale. Something that will be very important as we move forward through this topic is this line of code, push and pop. They will be important in terms of order. Yes, you will see in a minute. All right, so something to note is coordinate systems in P5. So thus far, just to review, when we place things, like let's say we're drawing a rectangle here and we have a value 150. This is saying we are going like 100 pixels from the left and 50 pixels from the top. So the higher this number over here, the farther down the thing is on the page. The higher the number is over here, the farther right the thing is on the page. So this is 0, 0 is the top left corner of your page or of your canvas. So yes, like this. I have these nice diagrams here. When you use transformations, you are actually moving the entire coordinate system as opposed to just the shape or the object that you're trying to move. So that's where things get really tricky. So this is how things normally are, right? We have our coordinate system at 0, 0 at the top left. If we think of this gray box as like our canvas or our page, if we do something like translate 150 and then have our rectangle at 0, 0, 50, 70, the actual coordinate system moves. It may appear like the rectangle's in the same spot because we're like here we're drawing the rectangle at 100 on the x-axis and 50 on the y, but here we are translating it 150, translating the whole coordinate system and then drawing our rectangle at 0, 0. So yeah, so normally when you draw a rectangle at 0, 0, it would draw here in the corner, right? But it's drawing over here because we've translated our entire coordinate system 100 by 50. So that's kind of the main caveat of transformations in P5.js. And that's why they're so irritating, because yeah, you move the entire page. So then it's like, how do I do a different transformation? Or this is messing up all of my coordinates. Like if I wanted to draw something, 10 pixels from the left of the screen, how would I do that now? Because everything has shifted over. Okay, so why might we want to use translate in this way if it's moving the whole coordinate system? While there are ways to get around this, before I show that, let me just talk about like reasons why you might want something like this. Accumulation, so translating things in relation to each other. Let's say, all right, so let me pull up my new sketch over here. Let's say I draw, I have an ellipse at 50 by 50, and it's 50 by 50. And I have a rectangle at 100 by 100. It's 100 by 100. Let's say I wanted these shapes to keep their distance from each other as is, but I wanted everything to kind of move around with my mouse. That would be a way to do that would be to use translate. Excuse me. So translate. All right. So let's say I do before I draw these shapes, I do translate mouse X, mouse Y. So I'm translating the whole coordinate system to be centered around my mouse. So now I have all of these shapes are placed in relation to my mouse, which is the new 0, 0 of my coordinate system. Yeah, so this may be something that you might want if you have like a complex pattern or configuration, like we did the self-portraits. Imagine you want like some kind of character to follow your mouse. That could be a way to do it. Yeah, so there are certain cases where you would want things to move in relation to each other. Cool. And before I get to moving things independently, let me just talk through some of the other transformations. So rotating. All right, so rotating. So before we start rotating stuff, there are different ways to rotate things. So what we're probably most used to in general is degrees, like you rotate something 45 degrees or 90 degrees, right? There are other units that are used in math and in coding called radians, which you might be familiar with. By default in P5, it's set to radians, and I just find that really difficult to work with because I'm more used to working with degrees. So there is a way to change that. You can set the angle mode in P5. So I will do that over here. And I'm thinking about that's something that you would put in setup because you're right. You're setting it up. You're changing the angle mode for your sketch once because you're just setting it and that's it, right? So I'll do angle mode degrees, and degrees is capitalized. I'm not sure why, but it just is. So that will just allow us to work with degrees instead of radians, which I just find easier. All right, so rotate. Okay, so back to rotate. So I did a few things off camera. Actually, I just edited this video for sake of time. But to better understand rotate, I just got rid of some of the other things that were in here before, like that translate example and the ellipse. So now I just have a blank canvas again. I still have my angle mode at degrees, and now I'm ready to start. So let's draw a rectangle. So I will put my rectangle. Let's put it at 150. And we will make it like 150 by 40. Cool. So there's my rectangle. And let's say I want to rotate it. Let's say I want to animate it. Why not, right? Like let's rotate it in an animation, in a circle. So let's use our handy dandy variables. I will set a variable up here. Let's call it my angle. And it starts at 0. So rotating. is just simply, let's do rotate. So instead of putting a number in here, I'll just use my variable. And right now it's set to 0, so I won't really do anything. But let's, kind of like how we did before with moving the ellipse across the screen, we will set my angle equal to itself plus 1. So every time this draw function runs, my angle increases by 1. Cool. All right, so what happens? You should see the rectangle come back. All right, there we go. So as you can see, similarly to how we were dealing with translate, things rotate around the center of the coordinate system as well, as opposed to their own center. So how do we deal with that? One way to deal with it is to change the coordinate systems, right? So we can move the origin of our canvas. So if we want our rectangle to rotate but stay at 150, what we can do is, before we rotate, translate. So translate 100 by 50, and then we can change this to 0, 0. So now we're actually like moving the whole coordinate system to where we want the rectangle to be. So we can just set the rectangle at 0, 0. All right. Right, so this works. The reason why it's not rotating around its own center comes back to the fact that unlike ellipses, rectangles are drawn they're positioned according to the top left corner, right? So I believe, let's look at the handy dandy P5JS reference. I believe there's a way to change that, like similar to how we did angle mode. I think there's like a rectangle mode. Yes, there is. All right, so by default it's corner, right? But we can do center, rect mode center. So let's copy that. I'm gonna put it in setup. Yeah. All right. Great. So now it is rotating around its center. That works. But what about if we wanted to rotate many things in different ways, or translate things in different ways, or I don't know, move things independent of each other? Because right now, what would happen if we even drew another shape? Like if I put an ellipse in my sketch at like 100 by 100, it would rotate as well. Yeah, so how do we fix that? That is where push and pop come in. Yeah, that's kind of a way to get around this fact that order matters in P5. It's a way to kind of like apply settings to certain chunks of code and not others. So yeah, so this is another way you can think about it. Push is like save, pop is like restore. So we can use this strategically to push and pop our code. So, right. So if we think about it, all of these translations and rotations in relation to the rectangle, we don't want to apply them to the ellipse. So what we can do is write push here and pop here. Ta-da. So you kind of like wrap whatever you want to be independent, like these settings that you want to only apply to certain things. You kind of like wrap those chunks of code in push and then pop. So now we could do something like, right, push again here, rotate -1 times my angle. So we'll rotate it like the opposite direction of whatever my angle is. And then right, pop. So we're kind of like wrapping these transformations in push and pop in order to like have them be independent of each other and not affect each other. Cool. And I forgot to translate here to the center, so that's why the ellipse is moving off screen. So we can do translate 100, 100, and then change this to 0, 0. Oh, but it's an ellipse, so you wouldn't see it rotating. Oh, I'm stupid. All right. Let's change it to a rectangle. There. All right. So it is rotating. And I guess it works. So it doesn't really matter, but I would actually move my angle, because my angle is not really part of like that at the iterating, like, sorry, incrementing my angle by 1 every time is not really part of this transformation issue. So I would move it outside of these push and pops. Yeah, I would organize it like this. So yeah, this is something to practice. But yeah, I like to think about it like I'm containing my transformations in their own scope so that they don't affect other things. But yeah, super, super helpful. You kind of need to use push and pop whenever you're using transformations in order to not displace everything in your sketch. All right, so at this point, let's do an in-class exercise. So you can pause the video and work on this, and then share it with me in our Zoom chat or on Google Classroom, whichever you get to. But for the in-class exercise, I would like you to create an animated pattern with multiple shapes moving at different speeds and directions. So use as many shapes as you want, but try to use at least 3, I would say. You know what? Let's say, actually, how about you use at least, just to make it really fun and crazy, how about we say instead of 3, use at least 8 shapes. And they can be the same shape. Like, I don't care if you use all rectangles or all ellipses, it's fine. But just use those shapes and play around with transformations to create an animated pattern. And these shapes need to be moving, not each one doesn't have to be moving in a different direction, but some of them at least. Like, I don't want all of your shapes to be moving exactly the same way. I want you to play around with the idea of push and pop, so that you can practice scoping things and using transformations in a way that allows for things to move independently. And then if you want, you don't have to use Sublime. Like, you can use the online editor for this because it's just an exercise, and then just share the link with us. However is easiest, either like in Zoom, in the chat, or over email or over Google Classroom. That's kind of how we're going to operate from now on, like using multiple channels to submit things, because we're just in different places with different levels of access to different tools. So I'm just going to be accommodating and say, like, use whatever tools make sense for you, as long as you get in touch. That's the main thing. Cool. So pause the video, do that, and then when you come back, I will talk about the homework. Welcome back. So for the homework, we are going to start I already sent this to you guys, but we're kind of officially starting this project now. And it's due week 11, April 9th. Our printing code scene. Obviously, we don't have access to facilities anymore, so I don't expect you to actually print anything for this project, but let's take a look. We can just work with, like, print-ready PDFs are fine. But, yes, printing code. Create a zine based on either generative or shifting visuals made with P5.js. So when I say generative or shifting, what do I mean? Generative meaning that your code produces a different graphic each time it's run. But according to parameters set in your code. So something I haven't talked about actually is, there's different, I'm open to however you want to work with this definition, but one way I can think of off the top of my head is, let's say you're using, in P5.js, there's something called random, which just allows you to get random values for things. So you can do things like place ellipse in a random point. So every time you load your sketch, like it's in a different place. That would, in a sense, be generative because you are using the same code to produce different outcomes, right? And I have this example up here. This wasn't made with P5, but I think it was made with processing. But the idea was these are logos for an app that Nike has called Project Moonshot. And they needed a lot of different icons for whatever. So this designer just used code to create these icons. And you can see they're all different, but there's some visual consistency, and that was built into the code. So this designer created code that had enough parameters so that there was some visual consistency, but allowed for infinite outcome. So that's essentially what I mean by generative. Your code produces different graphics every time, but according to some rule set that you define. And shifting. So what do I mean by shifting? You could think about this in terms of like animation, like maybe instead of having code that produces different graphics every time, you are instead taking stills of different points of your animation. Like let's say you have a pattern that animates, like a complex pattern that animates, and you want to use graphics from like where it's at 0 seconds versus 5 seconds versus 2 seconds. That's also acceptable. Basically think about ways in which you can use code to produce complex graphics. That's what this project is about. You can use stills or screenshots of this graphic. For generative, use at least 5 different outcomes. For shifting, use at least 5 different stills of the same animation. So basically use at least 5 different outcomes of your graphics to produce a printed zine. Once you have these graphics, you can move them around and lay them out in an Adobe program like InDesign or Illustrator, however you want. I'm open to how you want to creatively use these graphics. Like for example, although these icons were produced with code, they are used as like logos essentially. So yeah, I'm open to how you want to use your graphics in your zine or incorporate them. But you just need to, the actual graphics themselves have to be produced, like the actual illustrations, I guess you could also say, have to be produced with code in P5.js. I don't want you to actually like edit your graphics in Illustrator. I just mean that you can place them however you want or lay them out in Illustrator. And I also would like you to save your code, obviously, and turn that in as well. I should probably add that to this doc. And your zine should be at least 5 pages long. I'm open to how you want to format it. I just think maybe minimum, let's say the minimum like page size should be 6 inches by 9 inches. But yeah, I'm open to whatever you want. Like take complete creative liberty. This should be fun for you. It's really like conceptually about using code to produce complex illustrations. And just because we have time in this video, feel free to skip over this part, but I'll show you an example that I made. I didn't actually use P5, I don't think. I used another library called Paper.js, but the idea is the same. For this book called Permutations, I used code to create like different illustrations. So for example, this page is all different like cat faces. This was produced with code, so like every time you refresh the page you get like a completely different cat face, but obviously there is some like visual consistency between them all. So that was all just by like, tweaking numbers and parameters in my code to make sure that like, ears didn't go past here or something, but allowed for some very like randomness so that you got like a different result every time. And same with these. I mean, these I did a little bit differently because they're 3-dimensional, but all of this was like code. But yeah, have fun with it. This is going to be due week 11, April 9th. For homework this week, there's also a reading. I'm not going to ask you guys to like write anything in response or prove to me that you read it, but I really think it will help you with inspiration for this project. And it's actually not a like reading, it's a video. It's a lecture or it's a podcast actually, by this design firm called Design Systems International. They kind of take this idea of systems level design or generative design to heart. So this is like them talking about their process and using, they're both, I believe it's a 2-person team, and they're both graphic designers that code. So, and coding is a huge part of their practice. So I definitely recommend listening to that. In fact, it's your homework. You have to, but yeah, try to do that. It will help you with thinking about this project. Cool. At this point, you can stop the video, or if you want bonus content, I will go through loops, which is another JavaScript concept. And we'll also go over this in detail next class, so don't feel like you have to stick around for this, but just for fun to introduce loops. So loops are really useful in JavaScript. They're also very like conceptually hard to get a grasp on, so definitely like give yourself time to process what they mean. But I figured the easiest way to show you was with an example. So let's say I want to draw like a night sky and I want to have 1,000 stars. I could, of course, in P5 like type out ellipse, 0, 0, and carefully place my ellipses 1,000 times, but that's very labor intensive. So one way to deal with that is with loops. So loops are, well, in a sense, the draw function is a loop actually, but it's like a piece of code that runs over and over again. Whereas the draw function runs over and over again forever. It's like every frame of your animation. A loop, you can set how many times it runs. And this is what it looks like written out. It's kind of just syntax you memorize. But to break it up, what it's saying is for this first chunk var I equals 0 is the start of the loop. So let's say at the beginning I is equal to 0, and then this is the end of the loop. So basically we want this piece of code to run 1,000 times, because we'll draw a star or an ellipse inside of here each of those times in order to get 1,000 stars. So these 3 components up here are saying start at 0, go until you get to 1,000, and each time the loop goes, increase by 1. So the first time it goes by, we're at 0. The second time it goes by, we're at 1. The third time we go by, it's at 2. And yeah, by the way, you probably have already noticed it's a little confusing because it starts at 0 versus 1. That is something we'll also talk about next week. But yeah, so think about it starting at 0, then it's 1, then it's 2, then it's 3, so on and so forth. So this loop will run 1,000 times, excuse me. So, yeah, and you could like change this, like if you wanted to run 100 times, you would do 100. But that is the basic structure, the syntax that you use to write loops. And then whatever's within these brackets here, you can write code that will run. So let's do it. Oh, cool. And so I talked about random a little bit. Random is a way for you to, in P5, for you to get a random number between 2 numbers. So you can do like here in the example, it's saying, give me a random number between -50 and 50. Sorry, I'm losing my tabs. All right, so in our stars example here, we want to get a random number between, so we're going to use these random numbers to position our stars. And I want my stars, I want 1,000 stars, and I don't care where they are. I just want them to be like randomly positioned. But I need that number to be between 0 and the width of my canvas, because I don't want it to go off screen. So 0 in the width and 0 in the height. And let me just copy this over to a new sketch. And I'll save this one. Oops. All right, so in my draw function, I will copy and paste this over from the slides. All right, so before I run it, let me just go through line by line. So once again, we're starting at 0. We're going for this loop. Whatever's happening, this chunk of code is running 1,000 times. So what is inside of this chunk of code? So first we have var random x equals random 0 width. So what am I saying? I'm saying give me a random number between 0 and the width of my canvas and set it equal to a variable that I named random x. And then down here, I'm doing the same thing, but I am doing it for height, for the y value. And I also want the size of my star to be different, like random. And maybe I want to keep it between 0 and 5 for my radius. So this is giving me a random number between 0 and 5. I'm setting it equal to a variable called random radius. And setting the fill to white. And then I'm drawing an ellipse at my random x value, random y value, random radius value, random radius value. You might be thinking, variables. Didn't I say before variables should always be written at the top of our code? This is a case where you wouldn't want that, because if you think about it, each star is being drawn independently, right? Like the first time I'm running it, maybe I draw a star here. The second time I'm running it, maybe I draw a star here. So I want my variables to be defined inside of my loop because they're changing each time the loop runs, and I'm only using them inside the loop anyway. So it's not like I need it out here. And it's not like I need a starting value or something that's accessible within both my setup and my draw or something like that. It's like I'm redefining random x completely each time. And I guess I could technically do something like var. Yeah, I could, I guess, define it up here and it would work. But it's like I don't really need to do that. So keep everything in the same spot for now. And let me tab this so we can see. All right, and then I'm also going to change my background color to 0, which is shorthand for 000, black. Whoa. I guess it doesn't really look like a night sky. It looks more like TV monitor noise or something. But yeah, for every frame, these ellipses are being drawn randomly. But yeah, that's pretty much all I was going to show with loops. I will obviously go over it more in detail next class, but just they're pretty fun to play with. So if you wanted to get a head start, give it a try. Play around with these numbers, like, you know, change things around. Yeah, play around with these numbers, play around with everything, and have fun.